Thank you, Laura, and good morning, everyone. And Laura, can I say, I think you're exactly right. The urgency for this change is so real and clear, and the opportunity in making the change is also now clear and before us. The scale of change, though, is beyond compare. As we know, your projections, which we'll hear about shortly, show how challenging this leap is. It is a leap. We're at the end of a process in our climate law, which will require us to set sectoral targets for each of the main areas in our economy, and we know what they are. In electricity, we need a reduction between 62 and 81%. In transport, between 52 and 50. In our buildings, between 44 and 56. In industry, between 24 and 37. In agriculture, between 22 and 30. And in land use change, between 37 and 58. If we're to meet what are our science-based targets of we know what we need to do overall emissions reduction. What I'll be saying to my ministerial colleagues in the coming weeks is that to meet our targets, to play our part, to claim our place as a green nation in this challenge, every sector is going to have to be right at the top, at the upper end of those ranges. Because if any one sector falls behind in what is already a very challenging scenario for every sector, if one is less, then some other sector is going to have to do a lot more, and that may be a change which becomes truly impossible. There is a real challenge in each of those sectors. Those numbers are easy to put down on a paper or to even give it a speech. To achieve the real change is really significant and requires a complete transformation, as I think I heard you saying on the radio this morning. It's this system change that we're going to need to be able to deliver that sort of scale of reduction in the time frame that we're in. We know we have most of the plans, the broad plans in place. Our climate action plan itself, I think, is the right structure, is a good example of how to go about doing this. Our national development plan backs it up by giving funding for it. And we know now the European Union is doubling down in its green transition at the centre of European law and policy, and the Fit for 55 European legislation will be agreed in the coming months, which further give the underpinning, the regulatory structures in which this change has to be made. But what we need to do now is deliver real change. It's actually translating those broad plans into action, into emissions reductions across each sector. And what I wanted to do is highlight just some of the work that the government is doing in that regard, this focus on delivery being the centre of what we do. We've established 6 acceleration task forces, 6 leadership groups, which seek to learn from how we worked in COVID or in Brexit, where you get out of government silos, where you bring in outside agencies, where you bring in international and other outside expertise to see how do we accelerate it, not for 2030 or not for 2050, but for the next 3 years. Focus on the immediate changes we need to make on the path we know we're on towards to those sort of ceilings reductions. There are 6 teams, 6 acceleration task forces being set up. There could be further ones. The structure is the key thing. I might just give an example of some of that work and what we're aiming to do. Firstly, in the area of opportunity, and the sector with the highest sectoral target is in the electricity sector, because we know that this opportunity is in this country having some of the strongest renewable resources in the world and having real capability when it comes to the demand management and efficiency side of that equation. And also the war in Ukraine and the high fossil fuel prices requiring it to do this with even greater urgency to reduce our overexposure and reliance on fossil fuels. There's a whole range of different work that needs to be done on that. We've just completed our second renewables auction for onshore renewable power. It will deliver another 2,700 megawatts of onshore wind and solar. This is the second of 5 such auctions to bring us on this path to an 80% renewable system. And we can and will deliver that. But the really big scaling up is moving offshore. Every Northwest European country, most countries in the world are now, with access to an ocean, is starting to look at offshore wind as one of the big scalable alternatives. And we are well placed now to play our part and to take our part in that revolution that is taking place. The leadership team has 6 key tasks that they have to deliver. Firstly, the first phase of offshore auctions. It's already started. Applications are coming in for the consenting process for that first phase, and we expect the auctions to start before the end of this year. And those auctions have to be completed, consenting agreed, auctions completed, planning approved, and contracts started in this next 3-year period. The second phase, as we start, most of the auctions will be, with one exception, will be in the East Coast. Then we move south and west where the real large scale and large wind resources are. Again, we have to complete in the next 3 years those phase 2 auction process and get them into planning. They won't be complete or through that or won't be contracted, but we need to know they're on stream in this next 3-year period. And in this next 3-year period, we also need to know what we're calling the enduring regime, the long-term, really big scaled opportunity where we really tap into the huge resource that exists in the Atlantic. And that has to be state-led, not a Klondike, developers-led, everyone getting their own shovel and picking a part of the ocean and saying that that's mine, but still working with developers, the state planning, how we share that power, how we store that power, how we ship that power, how we turn it, convert it into hydrogen or ammonia, and other balancing and stored energy systems. And that too, that design and that plan, which EirGrid, our transmission operator, will lead, has to be in place and completed in the next 3 years. That needs ports. In this next 3 years, we'll have to develop at least 2 deployment ports. We're talking huge scale. We're talking quaysides which can take 10-metre draft for shipping and can carry a 1,500-tonne piece of metal that has to go out, and these huge turbines go out into the sea. And they have to be, those ports have to be contracted, planning, construction started, ready for deployment in the next 3 years. This is beyond compare. There's no project of that scale has been built in 3 years, but that's what we have to and what we will do. Every other European country is in a race for this because they're switching away from Russian gas, and if we're not fast, we will fall behind. And that's what I'm setting the team the task to do. It also requires upgrading our grid, particularly in Dublin. Dublin City has to have a new transmission grid, starting construction ready for delivery in the next 3 years, to take some of that offshore wind, but also to prepare to take all the heat pumps and electric vehicles we're going to need. And lastly, as I said, we have to, at the end of this year, develop our hydrogen strategy, which I believe will be a critical part of this clean energy opportunity transition, converting some of that excess wind power through electrolyzers into hydrogen for power generation, for industry, and for transport, heavy-duty transport applications. And again, that has to be now. We start now. That will take some time to deliver, but if we don't start now, we will miss out on that energy revolution that's taking place. It has particular consequences and opportunity for our deep water ports, where the heavy industry happens to be, the heavy users of hydrogen will be, and where we can bring the wind ashore. Second, I'm conscious of time here, but excuse me if I run slightly over, I'll try and be very quick. But the second of these acceleration task force teams already working is in the area of heat, how we heat our homes. And here we are far advanced. Here we are actually do have the opportunity, the best way of addressing the real issue of fuel poverty in our country at the moment because of high fossil fuel prices. We have the right structure in place. We are delivering. Willie Walsh from SEI here will, I'm sure, answer any questions in terms of we're meeting our targets set out even in February. We're up to 400 houses a month now in the warmer home schemes, where with the poorest houses, 100% grants. And that funding from the carbon tax for our social housing and for particularly poor sections of our society, that funding is guaranteed. That funding is working. The industry is massively expanding as we speak. There are young people coming into our apprenticeship schemes to work in it. We will deliver that. We are delivering that. That is happening now. And it needs to expand. It needs to be delivered as part of this acceleration task force team. But that on its own is not enough. Laura, you say we need additional measures, and you're right. I was at the Irish Green Energy Building Council recently, where they asked for a simple thing. Simple measures which we will get support from in European law, that by the middle of this decade, in this 3-year period, we start to measure the embodied carbon in buildings as a way of making the switch away from the excess use of cement towards the use of laminated timber and other products which can store carbon as well as reduce emissions. And critically, just to take one example of the acceleration projects, we've been talking about it for long enough, we now need to deliver it, is the likes of the district heating system where we take the waste heat from the incinerator being pumped out into Dublin Bay and instead use it to heat our houses along Pearse Street, our offices along the quays, and heat George in Dublin. We're not going to retrofit George in Dublin, but we know we need to retrofit every building, so instead we use waste heat and actually use that in a really efficient, effective way to reduce our emissions. That too has to start to be delivered in the next 3 years if we're to meet these targets. Sustainable transport. You rightly say transport and agriculture are two of the most difficult. They are, because there's an embedded development patterns, sprawled transport development patterns, which have been embedded after 5 decades of dependence on car-based transport systems rather than more sustainable transport systems. We won't meet our targets by just switching to electric vehicles. It won't work on a mathematical, geometric basis anyway. The road network will never cope. And also, the price of steel, the price of copper, the price of lithium, the price of cobalt, all those rare earth metals we need is likely to increase because it's a limited, scarce resource world. So we need to think more than just switching the fuels to electric. We need to do that at scale and at speed, but we also need a shift to active travel, to public transport, and to reducing the journey distances and times. It's strange, but coming out of COVID, the changing patterns in our transport system may help us do that. The introduction of remote working at scale, the reduction in all the amount of commuting that our entire transport system was designed and built around, allows us in this next 3 years to take some of the road space that was previously used for commuting traffic as the be-all and end-all in how we design our transport system, and instead take the space to provide for the Bus Connects projects and the active travel projects, which we are developing and designed. But we're not delivering them quick enough. So the key task in the Sustainable Mobility Task Force that's already up and running, the leadership group has been established within the Department of Transport, is to go to every council in the country and say, you come to us with what we're calling Pathfinder Projects, where you're willing to take the tough political decisions, and these are not easy political decisions. Every time we know this. We saw it in the Strand Road, we saw it in Salt Hill, in Galway. But we need to start making some of those decisions around the reallocation of space to make it safe to cycle and walk in our towns, villages and cities, and to make our public transport system super efficient so people switch over. And that has to be done in the next 3 years. That reallocation of space, doing what the likes of Robert Burns did out in Blackrock and Dundee, doing it very cheaply because we have €35 billion budget for this transport projects, but we have €70 billion worth of projects in development. So doing it quick and doing it in those sort of innovative experimental methods is what we're going to need to do. Third of these acceleration teams, probably the most challenging, the biggest, is in implementing the land use review. That's the key commitment in our programme for government. Again, the EPA is involved with Teagasc and with others on the evidence base at the moment to look to see what's happening in our land. One of the reasons our targets are so challenging is that science is saying we actually underestimated the effect of land use changes to what we've done. Our forestry was in the wrong place, high in the mountains in peaty soils. Those peaty soils were being drained and releasing carbon, which makes our targets, as we'll hear in the emissions projections later, all the more challenging. We need a land use plan which optimises first and foremost for rural development. There's no disconnection between human beings and nature. We're all part of the one system. So optimising for our rural life, family life, social life is the first optimisation. But it also has to be at the same time as we store carbon, restore biodiversity, and reduce pollution, water, nitrogen, ammonia, and various other pollution forms that are a challenge we cannot ignore. We have to do this in a combined way. So this land use review, in my mind, is the path and the future for Irish agriculture, for Irish forestry, and for nature restoration. It's the critical project, and this team is going to have probably the biggest challenge and most important task. But it's also full of opportunity. The diversification that will come from this more balanced use and management and care for our land is going to fund a whole new generation of farmers and foresters and ecologists and nature lovers who will protect our land system. The real focus here, in my mind, has to be on income, has to be on looking at new forms of farming that give the income, often to those, particularly the smallest poor farmers, who are blamed the most and who are least responsible in many ways for the problem we have. Looking at those suckler farmers, sheep farmers, grazing those peatlands in a way that actually help manage and store the carbon, because it doesn't release. If you allow just birch and natural forest to go up, it would release the peaty carbon from the soil. So that grazing can actually be part of a climate solution. And I bet you we can sell those cattle and sheep or dairy products coming out of such a farming system as a genuinely origin green product across the world with the highest premium, the highest price. I heard the chair and chief executive of Renewable on the radio this morning, and he knows that trade we do across the world on this origin green, this vision of Ireland as this, what it is, beautiful green land, the biggest risk to that is if we don't actually manage and care for our land, as well as our rural family farm communities. But doing it gives a premium. And that premium, in my mind, has to go to the primary producer, the farmer and the forester, and we can and will do that. So in the negotiations, when I'm going to the Minister of Agriculture and going for this higher target, which we know we have to do if we're to be serious about climate change, I think that's representing the best interests of the vast majority of Irish farmers, because it's guaranteeing them a future income. And there's so many other diversifications we could talk about that. Switch to solar as a way of paying farmers. Switch to anaerobic digestion done in a really sensitive way that isn't just about a massive expansion of slurry, which would create water and ammonia pollution problems, but which gives us a way of farming and solving the energy solution at the one time and paying the farmer for it. And in forestry, same again. My colleague Pippa Hackett's working at the moment on this idea of riparian tree plantation, changing the rules so it's more flexible, so you're not stuck in bureaucratic glue. If you wanted to do up to, let's say, a hectare strip of forestry within the farm to give you a future source of wood, to restore nature, to protect the quality of the land itself and the water course beside it. And lastly, just to take up what you said, Laura, about we need to do adaptation and mitigation at the same time. The best example of that is to switch away from fertilizer-pumped, expensive fossil fuel fertilizer-pumped ryegrass systems towards mixed sward grass systems, which are cut out the fertilizer, reduce the nitrous oxide emissions, which create this deep-rooted grass system that's much more resilient and better for climate adaptation in either periods of drought or heavy rain. And a better output, we learned from the Lions Estate and from Devonish and other farms who are starting to do it. It's an opportunity. It's good for climate adaptation, so we don't get the scarring of what happened in the 2018 drought again, and then in flood management systems we can cope better. I'm conscious of time, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to shorten my last three of these the last two working groups that I'm going to mention. Just transition. It has to be a just transition. It has to deliver. We won't maintain and get the support of the Irish people. It won't happen fast if it's not just. With meetings the last few weeks, the first meetings in establishing our Just Transition Acceleration Task Force, with Kieran Mulvey, our existing Just Transition Commissioner, with NESC Secretariat, who've real skills and expertise in the area. It's an example of pulling in all what we do well in our country, partnership. Patricia King on the Climate Advisory Council, real expertise in the area. The Just Transition Alliance last week, meeting them to listen to each other and work in collaboration to deliver that statutory office, flexible, preemptive, looking at problems before they arise and look to solutions as part of this just transition change. And lastly, the last of these 6 acceleration task force is in climate communications, which is important. It's important that we get the story right. It's very interesting. In meeting the EPA recent weeks, you were telling me, Laura, about the Yale, what's it called? The Climate Change in the Irish Mind analysis, which was published last December, showing what I sense is very true. Going around the country, listening to people, going around to councils across the country as I'm doing at the moment, backs up what that study says. The Irish people are aware of the science of climate change. They know it. and they want to be part of the solution. We actually have a good political environment for doing this, in my mind, because we haven't played this as a divisive political story. And I think the Irish people, right across the country, in all walks of life, understand that their children's future is at stake and we have to do something about it, that there is this urgency. They want to do it. Now, I know they could have woke up this morning and listened to Morning Ireland or whatever radio station news talk they were listening to and be slightly depressed. Oh, God help us, we're not meeting our targets, we're doomed, we're hopeless, we're the worst. And maybe some, even those who are sceptical about needing to take action on climate change, will turn over to the other side of the pillow, which there's no point anyway, we're not going to get there, there's no point even starting. That's not true. While this is challenging, while this is tough, and while we need to accelerate and start focusing on delivery, we can and will be good at this. This is better for our country. And yes, it will take us time to accelerate. Yes, you have to start doing a run-up before you make a leap, but we are heading in that direction. I'm convinced of it. Convinced of it because we've no choice. We do need to do it because the economy is moving in this direction. European legislation is moving in this direction. But also, we want to do it, my sense. And I'm encouraged in recent months, I've met a couple of times May Robinson at a few events, and she speaks about this conundrum about what seems like an impossible task. And she quotes Nelson Mandela that which seems impossible suddenly is impossible until you do it. And I think that similar sense of what seems like an impossible juggernaut to turn around, it is turning. We need to keep moving. We need to accelerate and make this leap in every sector. Thank you.